You've got a TV remote. Chances are there's one on your coffee table or tucked into the side of your couch right now. You use it every day without thinking twice. But what if I told you that for my dad, when he was just a kid, that simple little object became a tool of pure terror? He was home alone, finally old enough to be trusted by himself for a couple of hours. He was settling in to watch his favorite cartoons when his TV kept shutting off all by itself. He thought it was just a glitch, some technical problem he could fix. But it wasn't a glitch. When he finally got up to see what was going on, he found out someone was in the room with him, and they were holding the remote. This story happened to my dad, David, back in the fall of 1988. He was 9 years old, a skinny kid with knobby knees and a mop of brown hair that was always falling into his eyes. Back in '88, being home alone was a rite of passage. This was before cell phones, before you could check in every 5 minutes. There were no security cameras streaming a live feed to your parents' phones. There was just the landline on the wall and the trust your parents put in you. For a 9-year-old, being left in charge of the house for the first time felt like being handed the keys to the kingdom. It was a Friday night. The air was crisp, and it had that smoky smell of distant wood stoves and autumn leaves. My grandparents, his mom and dad, were going to a dinner party a few towns over. It was a big deal for them, and an even bigger deal for David. He'd pleaded his case for weeks, arguing he was old enough and responsible enough to not burn the house down. Finally, they agreed. My grandma knelt down to get eye to eye with him, her hands on his shoulders. "Now, David," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "the number for the party is on the fridge. Mrs. Henderson next door knows you're here. Just knock if you need anything. Don't open the door for anyone, and you can have one slice of leftover pizza. Got it?" David nodded, buzzing with excitement. He was going to be the king of the castle. My grandpa gave his hair a playful ruffle. "Be good sport. We'll be back around 10. And then they were gone. The sound of their car faded, and a deep silence settled over the house. It was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. It made the familiar 2-story house feel huge and uncharted. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from the fridge seemed 10 times louder. For a second, a little prickle of fear hit him. The house felt big, and he felt very small. He just stood in the entryway, listening. He could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room, a sound he never usually noticed. He shook his head, trying to clear away the nerves. This was his chance to be a grown-up, and grown-ups weren't afraid of quiet houses. His mission was clear. The Friday night cartoon block, a glorious 2-hour marathon that was usually a battle over volume and bedtime. But not tonight. Tonight, the TV was all his. He marched into the living room, the good room, with the newer, bigger television. It was one of those classic 80s console TVs, a giant piece of furniture in a fake wood crane cabinet. He grabbed the remote from the end table. It was a chunky black rectangle with big squishy rubber buttons. He flopped into his dad's favorite armchair, a plush recliner that smelled like old books and aftershave, and felt a surge of triumph. This was it, the peak of 9-year-old freedom. He had pizza, a can of soda he wasn't supposed to have, and total control over the remote. He aimed it at the TV and pressed the power button with a satisfying click. The screen flickered to life, washing the dim room in blue light. The theme song of his favorite cartoon filled the silence. He sank deeper into the chair with a happy sigh. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt cozy. He took a bite of cold pizza and settled in. For the next 2 hours, the world outside this room didn't exist. He was safe. He was in charge. Everything was perfect. The cartoon was at its best part. The hero was cornered. Laser blasts were flying everywhere. David was completely mesmerized, his pizza forgotten. The hero raised his shield. The music swelled. And then, click, the screen went black. The sound, the color, all of it vanished, plunging the room back into a dim quiet. The only light was a soft lamp in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows. The sudden silence was jarring. David's first reaction wasn't fear. It was just pure annoyance. "Oh, come on," he grumbled to himself. He figured it was just a power flicker. He waited, but the lamp stayed on. The fridge kept humming. It was just the TV. He aimed the remote and pressed the power button again. The screen blinked back on, picking up exactly where it left off. David grunted, satisfied. Problem solved. He relaxed back into the chair. Just a weird, random glitch. He got about 5 more minutes of cartoon bliss. The hero was chasing the villain through an asteroid field. The fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. David was on the edge of his seat, just as the hero was about to deliver his triumphant catchphrase. Click, blackness, silence. "You have got to be kidding me," he said, a little louder this time. Twice in 10 minutes. That wasn't random. He sat up straight, his king of the castle feeling starting to fade. He looked at the remote. Maybe the batteries were dying. That seemed logical. He got up and walked over to the TV. Those old console sets had a big physical power button on the front. He pushed it in with a loud ka-chunk. The TV roared back to life. He left the remote on the coffee table. If it was the remote, the TV should stay on now. Simple science. He stood there for a minute, daring it to turn off again. It stayed on. He felt confident. It was just the remote. He'd tell his dad they needed new batteries. Feeling like a detective who'd just cracked the case, he went back to his chair, not even bothering to pick up the remote. Problem solved. His victory lasted for all of 12 minutes. The first cartoon ended, and the next one started. He was mid-bite into his pizza when it happened again. Click. The room went dark for a third time. This time, the annoyance was gone. So was the confusion. It was replaced by a cold spike of unease that drove deep into his stomach. It wasn't the remote. He hadn't touched it. It was sitting 10 feet away on the coffee table. He had turned the TV on with his own hand. So what was it? He slowly put the pizza down. The silence in the room felt heavier now, like it was listening. He swallowed hard and stood up, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He walked to the TV again and stared at the blank screen. Maybe the TV was just old and broken. A wire was loose or something. He did what he'd seen his dad do 100 times. Balled up his fist and gave the side of the cabinet a solid thwack. Then he reached out and pressed the power button again. Ka-chunk. The TV flickered on. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off it, as if it were a wild animal. He retreated to the armchair, but stood behind it, using it like a shield. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. This time, maybe 30 seconds passed. Click. Black screen. A real wave of fear washed over him. This wasn't a glitch. There was a rhythm to it, a deliberate feeling he couldn't shake. It felt like a game. It felt personal. And suddenly, being alone in the big quiet house wasn't exciting anymore. It was terrifying. His mind raced. An electrical problem. But why just the TV? And why was it getting faster? The time between shutdowns was shrinking. He decided he needed more light. He walked over to the main light switch and flicked it on. The overhead chandelier flared to life, flooding the room with bright, sterile light, chasing away the shadows. For a second, he felt better. It's harder to be scared in a bright room. He stood in the middle of the room, scanning every corner, the furniture, the family photos, the curtains drawn tight. Everything was normal. He was just scaring himself. It was a faulty TV, and his imagination was running wild. He had to be. "Get a grip, David," he whispered. He came up with a new plan. One final test. He'd turn the TV on one more time, but he wouldn't walk away. He marched to the television, a boy on a mission. He pressed the button. The TV came on. He kept his finger resting on the plastic, staring at his ghostly reflection on the screen. 1 second, 5, 10. The TV stayed on. A tiny smile touched his lips. See? Maybe holding the button did something. Slowly, he lifted his finger. The TV stayed on. He pulled his hand back completely. Still on. A wave of relief washed over him. It was just a stupid, broken TV. He felt a little foolish. He had won. He turned his back on the TV to walk to his chair, a triumphant grin on his face. He took one step. Click. The sound was like a gunshot. But it wasn't just a click this time. It was followed by another sound from the far corner of the room. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against a wall. David froze. Every muscle in his body went stiff. The relief he'd felt a moment before was gone, replaced by a pure primal terror he'd never felt. The sound hadn't come from the TV. It had come from inside the room, from the darkest corner where the floor lamp stood, the one that had been casting all those long shadows. He stood perfectly still, his back to the television, his mind entirely focused on that sound. The only other sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He desperately tried to find a rational explanation, the house settling, a mouse in the wall. But deep down, he knew what he had heard. It was the sound of a person trying to be quiet, a person who was in the room with him. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. David remained frozen, a statue carved from fear. His back was to the corner where the sound came from, and a primal instinct screamed at him not to turn around. As long as he didn't look, it wasn't real. The house was dead silent. He thought about his parents. He thought about Mrs. Henderson next door, separated from him by a wall and a stretch of dark lawn that now felt like 1,000 miles. He needed to run. The thought was a bright beacon in the fog of his terror. Run out the front door, run to the neighbors. But his legs wouldn't move. They felt like concrete. What would you do in that situation? As a 9-year-old who believed he was alone, every horror movie he'd ever seen came rushing back, not as a story, but as a terrible possibility. Slowly, so slowly, he started to turn his head. His neck muscles were stiff with tension. He turned, inch by agonizing inch, towards the corner of the room. It was brightly lit now, but the corner where the tall floor lamp stood next to a big potted plant still held a pocket of deep shadow behind it. A perfect, person-sized void. His eyes scanned the area. The lamp, the plant leaves, the wallpaper. Nothing. There was nothing there. A shaky, hysterical laugh almost escaped his lips. Of course, there was nothing there. He had worked himself into a panic over a broken TV and a noise. He was an idiot. The relief was so immense, it made him feel weak. He finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He took a wobbly step toward his chair, ready to sit down, and that's when he saw it. It wasn't the shape of a person he'd been looking for. It was a tiny, impossible detail. In the deep shadow behind the base of the lamp, something glinted, a faint reflection from the overhead light. It was the plastic casing of a button, a red button, the red power button on the television remote. His blood ran cold. The remote was supposed to be on the coffee table. He had left it there himself. He let his eyes trace up from that single red glint, and as his gaze moved upward, his brain began to process the shape the shadows had been hiding. It wasn't a void, it was a form, hunched and squeezed into the tight space between the lamp, the plant, and the wall. It was the shape of a person, folded in on themselves in a way that seemed completely unnatural. He could make out a dark jacket, a bent knee, and then he saw the head. It was tilted at a strange angle. The face was turned just enough to be watching him. David couldn't see the features clearly. All he could see, all that mattered, were the eyes. They were wide, impossibly wide, and they caught the light with a wet, feverish glint. They were locked right on him, unblinking, and in the hand of this hunched figure, held so tight the knuckles must have been white, was the television remote. It was pointed directly at him, like a gun. The world dropped out from under him. This wasn't a ghost. This was real. There was a man in the living room with him, and this whole time, this entire terrifying game with the television, it hadn't been a glitch. It had been him. This man, hiding in the dark, had been watching him, and deliberately, sadistically, turning the television off, over and over again, just to see what he would do. The image of the man in the corner burned itself into my dad's 9-year-old mind. The horror bloomed in his chest and spread like ice through his veins. Every rational thought collapsed into one terrifying truth. He was not alone. How long had the man been there? Had he been hiding in that corner when his parents left? Had he watched them kiss him goodbye? Had he been there in the shadows as David strutted into the room, feeling like the king of the castle? The thought made him sick. The man had watched him eat pizza. He'd watched him get scared. He had watched every single thing. The entire house was a stage, and he was the unwilling performer for an audience of one. David stood, rooted to the spot, his gaze locked with the glinting eyes in the corner. The man didn't move a muscle. He remained coiled in the shadows, like a predator. His stillness was the most terrifying thing about him. He wasn't a burglar caught in the act. He was quiet. He was patient. He was watching. The man's face was mostly hidden, but David could see a gaunt, hollowed-out look. And those eyes, they were wide with a kind of crazed, intense focus. There was no clear emotion in them, not anger, not malice, just a profound and unsettling strangeness. It was the look of someone whose mind worked on a different plane of reality, a reality where hiding in a family's living room and playing cruel psychological games with a child made perfect sense. And the remote in his hand, it was the source of his power, the instrument of his terror. With that simple plastic device, he had turned David's joy into annoyance, his annoyance into fear, and his fear into abject terror. It was a bizarre puppet show, and David was the puppet, his strings pulled by the press of a button from a dark corner of the room. David tried to scream. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, just a tiny, choked gasp. His body had betrayed him, paralyzed by a fear so absolute, It had shut down his basic functions. He couldn't run. He couldn't scream. All he could do was stare at the unblinking eyes of the man who had stolen his safety. Time warped. Seconds felt like an eternity. What did he want? Why was he doing this? Was he going to hurt him? The lack of a motive was its own kind of torture. A robber you can understand. But this, a man who breaks into a home just to hide in a corner and turn off a kid's cartoons. It was insane. And then the man moved. It was a tiny motion. He shifted his weight, and the floorboard beneath him let out a low, mournful creak. The sound was like a physical blow. The man didn't stand up. He didn't rush forward. He simply adjusted his position, as if settling in. And as he moved, he raised the remote control slightly, aiming it more directly at the television. That small gesture was what finally broke the spell. He wasn't done. The game wasn't over. The thought of enduring another second of this torture was more powerful than the paralysis. It ignited his survival instinct. The man's movement was like a starting pistol in David's mind. The paralysis shattered, and a desperate energy flooded his body. The command to run was now a deafening roar. He didn't make a decision. His body just acted. He turned and bolted. His sneakers scrambled for purchase on the hardwood floor as he ran blindly toward the archway leading out of the living room. Behind him, he heard a sound. Click. The TV turned on. The cheerful cartoon theme song filled the room he was so desperately trying to escape. The sound of childhood innocence was the soundtrack to his terror. It was a final, mocking gesture. He burst into the entryway. The front door was 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs. He fumbled with the deadbolt, his fingers clumsy and slick with cold sweat. For a horrifying second, the lock wouldn't turn. He was trapped. He gave the lock another frantic twist. It gave way with a loud thunk. He threw the door open, and a blast of cold night air hit him in the face. It was the most life-giving sensation he had ever felt. He launched himself off the porch, his bare ankles stinging from the cold. He took the 3 porch steps in a single leap, landing hard on the damp grass. He stumbled but kept running. He ran across his own lawn, a space where he'd played 1,000 times. Now, a no man's land. He didn't dare look back, terrified he'd see the man's face in the window. His destination was the yellow porch light at Mrs. Henderson's house next door. He reached her front door and didn't bother with the doorbell. He just started pounding on it with both fists, over and over, screaming. The scream that had been trapped in his throat finally broke free. A ragged, hysterical sound. "Help! Please! Help me! Help!" Lights flicked on. The door swung open, and there stood Mr. Henderson in his bathrobe, his face a mask of confusion. David just sobbed, pointing a trembling finger back at his own dark house. "A man. There's a man in my house. He's in the living room." Mrs. Henderson pulled David inside, while Mr. Henderson immediately went to the phone. David could hear his deep, calm voice speaking to the police dispatcher, his serious tone validating the terror. It was real. Wrapped in a thick blanket on the Hendersons' couch, David started to shake uncontrollably. He kept replaying the image of the man's eyes, the crazed stare, the glint of the remote. He stared out their window at his own house. It looked so normal. But within minutes, the street was filled with the flashing red and blue lights of police cars, painting chaotic patterns across the front of his home. The police arrived and systematically swept my dad's house while 2 officers came to speak with him. A female officer knelt down to his level, just as his mother had, and her voice was gentle. David recounted the story, his voice trembling. He told them about the TV, the pattern, the sound, and the man with the unblinking eyes and the remote. He was terrified they wouldn't believe him, that they'd think he was just a scared kid with an overactive imagination. But they listened. They wrote everything down. A few minutes later, the officer searching the house came to the Hendersons' door. His face was grim. "The house is clear," he announced. "We've checked everywhere. There's no one here." David's heart sank. "But he was there. I saw him." The officer nodded. "I believe you, son. But he's gone now." He explained they'd found no signs of forced entry. Every door and window was locked, except for the front door David had fled through. They found the TV remote on the coffee table, right where David had left it. No strange fingerprints. They searched the corner of the living room. The lamp was there. The plant was there. Nothing else. The lead officer got on his hands and knees with a flashlight and noted a faint indentation in the carpet, as if someone had been putting pressure on that spot for a long time. But it was flimsy. It wasn't evidence. My grandparents arrived home to a parent's worst nightmare. Police cars flooding their home with flashing lights. My grandma wrapped David in a desperate hug as he told the story all over again to his parents, who listened with pale faces. The police never found the man. The case eventually went cold. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. David was unharmed. Legally, the only crime was trespassing. But my dad knew the real crime was the theft of his safety. The weeks that followed were hard. He couldn't sleep in his own room. The slightest creak of the house sent him into a panic. He could never again be in the living room alone, his eyes always drifting to that corner, half expecting to see a hunched shape in the shadows. Even now, as a grown man, that night has never left him. It's why he's so meticulous about locking doors. It's why he has a deep-seated distrust of quiet houses. The questions still haunt him. Who was that man? How did he get in and out of a locked house without a trace? And the most chilling question of all, what did he want? Why play such a bizarre, terrifying game? The horror of that night wasn't a monster or a ghost. It was in the inexplicable, irrational nature of human cruelty. The man in the corner didn't need a weapon to inflict terror. All he needed was a dark corner, a patient attitude, and a simple television remote. That's the story of what happened to my dad. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't what goes bump in the night, but the quiet things that hide in plain sight. Have you ever had a strange experience in your own home you couldn't explain? Let me know in the comments. I read all of them. And if you want more strange and mysterious stories, make sure you gently press that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing.